Hello. In presentations at this conference, we've been looking at offline reading achievement gaps. And in this session, we want to explore the challenges and the opportunities that emerge from online reading achievement gaps. So we look at a specific type of achievement gap based on economic status. NAEP reports fairly consistent since 2004 anyway, 25-point standardized score gap between students who are eligible and not eligible for free lunches. In addition, NAEP also shows that over twice the percentage of students in the below basic level in reading come from students who are eligible for free lunches. Now that's a fairly consistent, but most importantly, a very substantial reading achievement gap. Now, Sean Reardon at Stanford, using national assessments of reading such as NAEP, shows a growing reading achievement gap based on family income. He uses a 90-10 split, and it's almost doubled since 1940. This is a fundamental challenge because the rich appear to be getting richer and the poor appear to be getting poor, at least in terms of reading achievement. Now, the next point we want to make is that online reading and offline reading are similar but not identical. There's a fairly substantial now and growing research base showing that these two are similar, but there are some differences between the two. One of the things we know about an online reading achievement gap by economic status comes from a study that we conducted and was published in Reading Research Quarterly a couple of years ago. We looked at state reading achievement as a measure of offline reading and found, as NAEP found, a significant achievement gap by economic circumstance. We used two different school districts, one with a median family income of 120,000, one with median family income about 60,000. And so the difference here between the two school districts was about 2 to 3 years in terms of offline reading. In terms of online reading, the difference was about 1 to 2 years difference. This was at the 7th grade level. And that was when we controlled for pretest differences in offline reading, offline writing, and prior topic knowledge. So this is just coming solely from online reading differences. And that difference was fairly substantial. When we looked at some of the components of what we call online reading, we found that across all components, these differences were manifested. A special note, for us anyway, is the evaluation component, which in both categories, both populations of students, was somewhat smaller. Now, the point of what we're saying here is that when we look at NAEP reading achievement gaps, and we add online reading achievement gaps, the challenges are even greater than what we might think if we only look at NAEP data, which represents offline reading. NAEP is delivered online today, of course, but the reading tasks are basically offline reading tasks, not online reading tasks, as Elena will explain.
Thanks, Don. So as Don mentioned, he talked about some of the challenges that we face with regards to online reading. And I want to take this time to talk about some of the opportunities that we have within those challenges. And first, I want to take a step back to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say online reading. So I want to talk about some of the different possible forms of what online reading might be, since this term can mean different things to different people. And then I specifically want to focus on a form of online reading that we refer to as online inquiry. I want to focus on this particular form because we think it's really one of the most important forms of reading that students need to learn to really be able to engage with the world today on both a personal and a professional level. And it's also quite complex. So first, we thought it would be helpful for us to understand what kids are actually doing with their time when they are reading in digital spaces. And again, we understand that reading can mean different things to different people. So we can take a look at these graphs. These are from the Common Sense Media Report from 2019 on what tweens and teens are actually doing with their screen time. So you can see that they are spending a good chunk of their time, about 50 and 40% respectively, doing things like watching TV and video, which are quite passive activities. But we can also see that they're doing a lot of other things that can actually require more complex cognitive thinking. And these are really the kinds of cognitive processes that we want students to be using as they're reading. So we see that they are doing things like gaming, they're browsing websites, engaging in social media, and they're actually creating content as well, which can require some high-level thinking skills. They're video chatting, and they're also doing a little bit of e-reading. So we can see that students are engaging in multiple forms of reading, multiple forms of activities around text, and they're also engaging with multiple forms of text. I also want to take a minute to acknowledge that when kids are spending time on social media, they're likely encountering many different types of text, some of which can be really complex and controversial. So as you can see here, a friend and colleague of mine recently posted an article about the controversial AstraZeneca vaccine. And we know that tweens and teens are posting similar kinds of articles and also posting links to other sorts of information. And so it becomes really important for people to be able to evaluate these texts and understand the different perspectives that are presented across these texts, because this is where many students and many people are actually getting their information today. So as I mentioned, I want to take this time to focus on a particular form of online reading that we refer to as critical online inquiry, or hopefully it's critical, because as Don mentioned, evaluating information is really one of the central practices of reading online. So we refer to this practice as online inquiry because readers pursue understanding around a particular question or topic of inquiry. And online inquiry involves at least 5 practices that include questioning or developing some questions that you want to understand the answer to, and then locating, evaluating, synthesizing, and communicating information. So for example, this is an online inquiry that we might all be familiar with by now is, should I wear a mask? You might want to know the answer to this question. And you can probably see that this question doesn't necessarily have one right answer. So the answer to this question can depend on who you are, it can depend on where you are, whether you're inside or outside, or even where you live in the world. It can depend on your local laws and policies, and it can even depend on where we are in the pandemic. So right now I'm fully vaccinated, and so my decisions around whether I wear a mask or not might might be a little bit different than they were a few months ago. So to answer this question, for people to figure out whether they should wear a mask or not, they might do things like, you can see up here, this is a New York Times strip of information, and you can see there are these maps or diagrams of where in the world the risk is highest and also where people are vaccinated. You can also see a little snippet of text up there, which shows the risk in my county, in Essex County in Massachusetts, and it shows that my area is at very high risk. I might also engage in a direct question query where I'm actually typing into Google my question, should I wear a mask? And I have to evaluate the search engine results page, determine which link to select, what information I want to read. People might also decide to go to well-known websites like the CDC to try to understand what the guidance is around that. And then finally, of course, people might go to social media groups. So this is an example of a Facebook group from the town that I live in, where people are talking about what the local policies are, and specifically trying to figure out what the guidelines for their local CVS might be. So while some of us might think of Facebook as housing less credible texts, there can be instances where the very local information that people get is actually quite relevant. And we know that this is a place where people get a lot of their information. So I want to talk about the opportunities that we have for instruction and assessment around critical online inquiry. So first, I think it's important to acknowledge that we really need assessment and instruction that are mutually informative and that focus or at least attune to the different 21st century digital literacies. And there are three opportunities around this and around specifically critical online inquiry instruction that I'm going to talk about. So the first is that we really need to commit to complex critical online inquiry instruction, especially for readers who struggle. So often these forms of digital reading are seen as sort of icing on the cake instruction that happens after the essential or core reading instruction has been completed. And oftentimes it's only for readers who excel. But I think in our digital age, we really have to make sure that all students receive this kind of instruction in online inquiry and that they have the tools to be able to make sense of these newer texts across multiple texts and perspectives. Often what we see instead is that readers who struggle the most actually get the least of this kind of complex reading instruction in both offline and online contexts. So we really don't think it's a surprise that we're seeing readers who struggle the most kind of pull away from other readers in some of our assessment results. Instead of giving these readers who are already struggling opportunities to engage in challenging and interesting reading activities, these students are often the students who get the least interesting and the least challenging reading instruction. And sometimes they even get very rote phonics instruction with the idea that they have to learn to read before they can really engage in reading to learn activities. We know that learning to read and learning phonics is really important with our code-based language, but we also know that it's important for all readers to have opportunities to engage in really complex inquiry, like the kind of reading instruction that online inquiry can provide. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the need to begin early. So we don't need to wait until middle or high school to start teaching some online inquiry practices. Even very young children can do this, and we need to be able to start early with this. And then finally, we know that many students come into our classrooms with multiple digital literacy practices, and we actually have a really nice opportunity to be able to leverage these practices to teach things like online inquiry and to engage students in high-level reading comprehension instruction. So online inquiry instruction can do a number of things for students. We've seen that it can lead to significant learning gains, specifically for readers who struggle. In offline contexts, when students are engaged in project-based inquiry that coheres around a particular issue or topic, like online inquiry instruction does, even very young children can develop disciplinary vocabulary and knowledge that can help them within a discipline. We also know that online inquiry can teach students how to make sense of multiple forms of text and the affordances and constraints of each, which is really important for students to be able to decide and make decisions about why they might choose a particular type of text to communicate a particular thing to a particular audience. And it also teaches them to make sense of the different forms of text that they see online, as we saw from the wearing a mask, those different texts that we showed. And then finally, online inquiry instruction can really help students develop collaborative and evidence-based reasoning skills, which are important in offline reading instruction as well. So first, when we commit to teaching all students critical online inquiry instruction, there are two things I want to focus on. The first is circling back to what Don said, and is the need to focus on teaching students how to evaluate the relevancy and credibility of the information that they encounter. When we're reading online, students have to choose which text they are going to read, and so they have to sort of sift through all of the potential texts that are out there and choose where to get their information. And the second practice is that we want to engage students in crucial conversations where they have opportunities to really look at the evidence provided in online resources and determine what's more or less credible and determine which information they should learn from. So this diagram shows the process of online inquiry, as we talked about. So you can see Students develop questions, and then they locate potential resources. Then they synthesize and evaluate across those resources. And then they might take a step back and really draw some reasoned conclusions from the text that they deem more rather than less credible. And at the center of this process is evaluating the relevancy and credibility of text. So you can see that triangle. So this diagram shows that triangle up close. So you can see what we want is we want students to be able to evaluate the content or the claims and evidence that they see. But in order to do that, they might also look at the source of that information, the source of that content, and the context or the document features and the setting. So what the social and political context of their inquiry is. On top of that, students might go into this process with a few key habits of mind. We want readers to be proactive, and we want them to triangulate evidence within and across these three tiers and across multiple different sources and perspectives as they're trying to negotiate potentially conflicting perspectives in an online environment. And then we also want students to have what we refer to as flexible skepticism. We want them to be open to different ideas. So not just going into an online inquiry process, sort of cherry picking evidence that fits what their argument is, but really going in with an openness to examining different kinds of evidence. But we also want them to be critical of that evidence and to be able to look at it critically and question whether it's accurate or not. The second thing we want students to be able to do is to engage in critical conversations. So this is also in line with offline reading instruction. So critical conversations engage students in collaboratively addressing really relevant and meaningful issues. It also engages them in evidence-based reasoning and argumentation, gives them the chance to collaboratively evaluate the information sources and the evidence that they find, and to discuss how credible information might be based on what they find in terms of content, source, and context. Students have the opportunity to make sense of multiple complex texts and varying perspectives, and they can examine their own beliefs, biases, and identities. When students are working in a particular disciplinary area, this also gives them the opportunity to develop different knowledge and practices that are important within a given discipline. And then finally, as students are engaging in critical conversations, they might have different opportunities to participate at a level that's comfortable for them and to draw on existing funds of knowledge that they bring into the classroom. And so critical conversations give different students opportunities to participate depending on what makes sense for them. One important question, though, that we are faced with is how to really assess this important practice. It's challenging to assess this collaboration, but it's something we think we really need to think about how to do well. The second thing that students need to do, or that we want teachers to do, is to start early. So even very young readers can engage in critical online inquiry. And educators can start by developing a culture of collaborative inquiry. So during regular classroom instruction, if there's something that the class doesn't know and they want to know, teachers can walk over to a smartboard or a computer or tablet and just model for students how to find out the answer to that information or to that question. And as they're doing that, teachers can also model the habit of mind of being critical about the sources that they're choosing and how they're determining where to find the information and which information to believe. The other thing we can do with young children is to teach online inquiry and use digital texts within the context of texts and activities that students are already familiar with. So using hands-on activities and offline texts. So for example, this is a common first grade science activity. Some of you might be familiar with this, where students are planting seeds and developing some hypotheses about which plant or which seed might grow taller and why, depending on where they place it. So here, these students were collecting data based on how much water they put in the seeds. And they used a quick Google search about how a seed grows to develop a hypothesis about whether they thought which plant they thought would grow taller. You can see they also developed traditional hand-drawn diagrams. You can see this up in the right-hand corner. So they were really using hands-on activities and then offline and online text and integrating across there. Students also used traditional books, so paper-based books, but then also integrated that with newer online texts like video to understand how those seeds might grow and what was happening under the soil as their seeds grow, the part that they couldn't actually see. And they used an online diagram as a mentor text for them to see what they might actually draw in their own observations. So we can see students are integrating texts across offline, online, and hands-on learning. So it's a way for even very young children to start using some online resources and conducting online inquiry that's also supported by offline inquiry. Finally, we want to build on students' funds of knowledge for digital literacies. So we can really seek to understand and also build upon the practices that students bring into our classroom, just as we do with offline literacies. We know that students often live very rich online lives, sometimes that we don't even know about. And so we really want to take an opportunity to try to figure out what is it that students are doing in their free time online, on screens, like that Common Sense report showed, and how can we build on that? So how can we give students opportunities to maybe share those with other students in the class and to use those practices, those digital literacy practices, in units of instruction? We can also position students as competent and proactive digital readers. So one thing we can do is administer a digital literacies interest survey, as we would do with offline reading, and ask students what kinds of practices are they doing at home that they might be able to use in the classroom. And the last thing we want to leave you with is the idea of really situating students as existing at the center of their inquiry. Online inquiry can be really complex, and traditionally we have tried to actually simplify this process for students, either by giving them, lists of vetted websites or overly simplistic checklists that they can use as they evaluate information and conduct online inquiry. But this isn't necessarily helpful as they are trying to read and make sense of texts in the wild west of the internet. So students really need to be positioned as capable of engaging in this complex online inquiry. As Don talked about, online reading gaps may be even greater than we understand, but we also see that online reading is a really crucial practice for anyone living in our 21st century society. So this is definitely a challenge for us as educators to figure out how to teach such a complex practice. But we think these challenges also present really important opportunities for us to leverage the digital literacies that students are bringing into our classrooms. We know that students have a desire to make sense of the media-rich context that they are living in, and that they're constantly engaging in. And particularly as they're wrestling with important and relevant issues in the world, especially as we've seen students grapple with in the last year, we want to give them opportunities to engage those interests and those issues. So to do this, we can position students at the center of their own inquiries and help them engage in the really relevant and meaningful issues that are important to students and also to the broader worlds in which they live. Thank you.
Which element of online reading do you consider to be the most important for classrooms to support?
Well, I'll begin first. From my perspective, all of them are actually end up being important, because a failure in any one of the elements is going to lead to breakdowns in all of the other ones. So, for example, if you can't locate something, it's very hard to comprehend anything and learn anything from online information. If you can't critically evaluate things, it also makes it impossible to know what the reliable information really is out there. And we've seen the consequences of that recently. And integrating information is the same thing. We want students to integrate. Most of them don't. They tend to go for one source and use that. So all of them are important, I think. As I said, most recently, I think we've seen the breakdown of critical evaluation in much of the information flow in our nation recently, and so that may be one targeted area that people may be most concerned about. But I'll leave that to Elena. She has additional perspectives, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I would say, not surprisingly. I think, as Don said, the practices are so integrated and so iterative that you almost can't teach one without the other. And I think, I've thought a lot about critical evaluation for a number of years now, and I've come to the place where it's almost like you can't talk about evaluation without talking about the other practices. And so it's, I think the way I think about it now is when we're teaching kids how to evaluate relevancy and credibility, we have to do it within the context of the entire inquiry, rather than, pulling websites off of the internet and saying, okay, do you think this is relevant or do you think it's credible? Because it's really contextual. And it depends on their inquiry question, and it depends on the source of the text, where it came from, who's putting it out there. And students have to be able to, as Don said, locate the text first. And if they can't do that, they can't, synthesize the information in it or determine how credible it is. But I do think that because evaluating credibility and relevancy is such a complex skill, that it is something we know we need to focus on. And so I think it can be something that we attend to and center when we're teaching online inquiry.
How do you think that online reading is currently being captured in assessments, both classroom and large scale? And what do you think that means for online instruction and reading?
I mean, I think we are starting to move towards trying to capture online reading, which doesn't just mean, just to clarify, it doesn't just mean when kids are reading on a screen. That, of course, is something different. That's more like offline reading that's done on a screen. But in terms of assessing online reading or critical online inquiry, the way we talked about it, we're starting to see that in NAEP and certainly even in PISA and ePearls, where kids are reading websites and even reading multiple websites within a task. I don't know how much evaluation of credibility or accuracy or even relevancy is going on. And I think often those websites are very sort of cleaned up. So they don't often, and this depends on the assessment, but they don't always have the number of different sort of textual features going on, advertisements, other sort of small snippets of text. And so they look like simpler versions of real websites. And that's not always true. ePearls certainly looks like a lot like real websites, but still doesn't measure how students are evaluating credibility, which is a really complex skill, and how they're negotiating across multiple texts and perspectives. So I think we're starting to see it in a sort of simplified version. And one of the challenges that we face, that Don, you can probably speak to this more, is sort of when we're creating assessments, we're always trying to control the environment so that we can measure what it is we want to measure. But the internet is this, as I said in the presentation, it's such a wild west where there are a lot of things going on, and it's a very unbounded and uncontrolled environment. It's not like a single text. And so I think it does present challenges for assessment that are certainly challenges, they're not insurmountable challenges. And hopefully, in the next few years, those will be things we will address as we wrestle with that.
Yeah, I would also add one of the Another layer of the complexity with assessment is matching up with the tools that students use to consume their information. Most students are using their cell phones, and we assess with laptops and desktops. So cell phones put certain constraints on things and create other opportunities on things. And so students are getting text and all kinds of messages from many channels at the same time while they're consuming information. We really have no assessments that take any of that into consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you, Benita, and thanks to the attendees.
Thank you.